My ex-gangster dad was released from prison and came back as a delicate beauty. Before we start, please like and subscribe. Chapter 1: The Prison Pickup Disaster. You ever have one of those moments where your brain just refuses to process reality? Like, your eyes are wide open, your body's moving, but your mind is screaming nope, not today? That was me, standing on the cracked pavement outside Blackridge Federal Penitentiary, clutching my arms tight against my chest like I could hold myself together. My heart was beating so hard, I swear it was louder than the distant hum of the prison gates. I was waiting for him. Zane the Iron Fist Calloway. The name hit my ears like thunder, even 15 years after his arrest. A ghost. A legend. The kind of man whose reputation alone could silence entire rooms. His story was everywhere, whispered in alleyways, echoed in dark corners of every criminal enterprise. His punches were like sledgehammers, his glare a weapon that could break a person without ever laying a hand on them. He was a nightmare made flesh. He was the man that entire gangs folded in fear of. A wrecking ball in human form. And apparently, he was my father. I had never met him. In fact, he was arrested before I was even born. The only thing that tied me to this mythical, terrifying man were the stories people told behind closed doors, the scraps of old photographs where his face was half obscured by shadows, and the reputation that stuck to me like tar. A reputation I could never outrun. So yeah, I braced myself. I prepared for the worst. For a brutal, battle-worn man, covered in scars, muscles like steel, and a voice so gravelly it could cut through metal. A monster of a man. Someone who could stare you down and make you wish you'd never been born. Instead, I got this. A man stepped out from behind the steel gates, and my brain went into full-on denial mode. I had no idea how to process what was happening in front of me, because he was beautiful. Not just good-looking, not even just pretty, he was ethereal, glowing like something out of a fevered dream. His skin, flawless as porcelain, shimmered in the afternoon light, as if the sun had personally decided to kiss him. His hair, impossibly long and flowing like a god's, danced in the breeze as though it had its own life. It caught the wind. I half expected a dove to land on his shoulder and start singing. His features were so sharp, they looked carved from marble. He didn't just look elegant, he radiated elegance, like he'd just stepped off the set of a high-budget drama, not a maximum security prison. I turned to my mom, Evelyn Calloway, CEO, mogul, and, I'd bet anything, the kind of woman who could crush you with a smile if she felt like it. A woman who had spent a lifetime making things happen. No one could intimidate her, not even my dad's reputation. And right now, she was standing there like she'd just seen a ghost, her lips curling into something that looked suspiciously like adoration. "Mom," I whispered, the words slipping out in disbelief. My voice barely registered above the noise of my rapidly thumping heart. "Who the hell is that?" Mom turned to me, cool as ever, that calm, unbothered smirk spreading across her face. "That's your father." I blinked, trying to wrap my mind around the impossible. No, it isn't." But then he walked toward us, glided toward us, and I couldn't stop myself from staring. There was something wrong about it. His every movement was so deliberate, so graceful, that it felt out of place. Like watching someone waltz through a street fight. He didn't walk. He floated. I half expected him to step on a puddle and have it part around his feet like the Red Sea. And then, when he got close enough, he smiled. Not a half smile, not a flirtatious grin. It was a soft, knowing curve of his lips, one that had too much warmth, too much affection, and I felt the air in my lungs freeze. His smile wasn't just disarming, it was heartbreaking. "Ellie," he said, his voice smooth, refined, every word like polished glass, smooth, and without the rough edges of a hardened ex-gangster. "You must be Ellie." I froze. My throat was tight, like I couldn't quite find my voice. Was I supposed to know how to feel about this? I nodded slowly, unsure if my brain could even process what I was seeing. Yeah." He sighed softly, like he could feel the weight of the years lost between us. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you." I blinked. Wait, he's sorry? For what? For abandoning me? For being an absentee father who let his criminal empire eat him alive? Who chose a life of violence over his own daughter? Was he really apologizing? I stammered, pulling myself together just enough to utter the first thing that came to mind. "It's fine." He gave a small, tender smile. And it was like all my defenses just crumbled. This man was supposed to be the terrifying monster I had spent my whole life fearing. But instead, I felt guilt, a sense of longing, confusion. "Let's go home," he said gently, his voice as soft as a lullaby. But it carried the weight of a man who had seen too much of the world. And I stood there, frozen, as he turned and moved toward the car. His every step so fluid, so impossibly elegant, that it was as if he belonged on some distant mountaintop, not standing in front of me, a girl whose entire life had been defined by his absence. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake him. What was I supposed to do with this? Mom chuckled, watching me from the corner of her eye. Survival, she said, that same knowing glint in her eyes. I glanced at her, but it didn't help. Nothing made sense anymore? Not an answer. Not even close. Chapter 2. Bar fights and ballet moves. We took Dad to dinner. It was supposed to be a simple, peaceful welcome home meal. A little reunion, maybe some awkward silence as we figured out how to be a family again after 15 years. You know, the usual. A nice, quiet evening to ease him back into the world. Something wholesome and low-key. It was not. Because of course, this is my family, and nothing in our life is ever normal. Not even dinner at a mediocre Italian restaurant. It started innocently enough. Just a couple of drunk guys, loudly harassing a waitress, nothing new. The classic bar fight setup. Someone tried to step in and break it up. A few words were exchanged, and then a chair went flying. Whoa, Mom sighed, her face completely unbothered as she set down her glass of wine. Idiots. I groaned, covering my face with both hands. This was going exactly where I knew it was going. You just couldn't have a nice, normal night in my family. We should leave before? Too late. One of the brawlers, clearly not aware that this wasn't his fight, stumbled backward and crashed straight into Dad. In an instant, beer splashed across his pristine white sleeve. The entire restaurant went silent. Not a murmur, not a clink of silverware. Just that awkward, heavy silence that signals everyone is waiting for something to happen. Dad didn't even flinch. He just looked down at the stain, his fingers brushing over the fabric like it was a fine piece of art being ruined by some uncultured fool. He sighed, almost wistfully, as if he had just spilled a glass of wine at a black tie gala. I stared, wide-eyed. Was he upset? No, he wasn't upset. He was elegant. The drunk guy sneered, clearly enjoying the tension. What? You gonna cry about it, princess? I almost choked on my own spit. Whoa, hell no. I already knew exactly how this was going to end. The guy swung a punch wildly, of course. Classic. But Dad, he didn't dodge. He didn't block. He didn't even move in a way that looked like it could be useful. It was like he was in a different dimension. One effortless step back. A fluid pivot of his foot. So graceful it could have been a dance move. And then, he tilted his head slightly, as though the punch was an annoying fly, and it whiffed right past him. Another attacker lunged forward. All muscles and testosterone. Dad sidestepped, without breaking a sweat, and then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he lifted one foot and gently, tripped the guy, as though he was helping him to the floor, rather than sending him crashing to the ground. It wasn't even a fight. It was like watching a ballet. A violent ballet. More attackers came charging in, too cocky, too sure of themselves. One by one, they made their move, and one by one, they all failed. The best part? Not a single one of them had any idea what had just happened. They were all lying on the floor, motionless, probably wondering if they'd accidentally tripped over their own feet. Dad sighed again? This time, it wasn't an "I'm disappointed in you" sigh. It was the kind of sigh you make when you're sick of dealing with idiots. 10 seconds later, 5 men were sprawled across the floor, completely out of commission. Not one of them conscious enough to complain. And as for Dad, he looked like he had just stepped out of a spa. Not an impromptu bar fight. His hair? Still perfect. His shirt? Flawless. He didn't even have a bead of sweat on his forehead. The entire restaurant was frozen. Not a soul moved. And then, from the far corner of the room, an old man at the bar, probably way too drunk to know better, mumbled under his breath. The iron fist. Dad didn't even flinch. He turned, offering the old man a smile that could melt glaciers. Oh, I don't go by that anymore. He said it with such politeness, so gently, that I had to stop myself from actually laughing. It was like he was offering the guy a cup of tea, rather than explaining the man he once was. And then, because it wasn't enough for him to be an absolute vision of elegance amidst total chaos, he calmly adjusted his cuffs. Cuffs. I mean, seriously. Mom couldn't contain herself. She burst out laughing. The kind of laugh that makes everyone else in the room wonder if they've missed something. She slapped her hand on the table. Oh my God. This is too much. I buried my face in my hands, embarrassed beyond belief. Please, kill me now. I couldn't believe it. My ex-gangster father, who was supposed to be the most terrifying man alive, had just wiped the floor with 5 grown men, all while looking like a delicate runway model who had never seen the inside of a prison. I was officially done with this life. Dad. I mumbled through my fingers, barely able to process the scene in front of me. What just happened? Dad, his voice as smooth and effortless as ever, turned to me and raised an eyebrow. Ellie, he said, his tone almost amused. What, you didn't know? I used to handle problems like these all the time. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. What kind of monster could casually annihilate 5 men in a restaurant while sipping a glass of wine, and then make it look like a routine chore? I had no idea. But this was my life now, and it wasn't even the weirdest part. Chapter 3. Uncle Marty's heart attack. We visited Marty, Dad's old best friend. Now, Marty had a reputation that was almost as terrifying as Dad's. Once a notorious fixer, the kind of guy who could make problems disappear with a flick of a wrist and silence anyone who dared speak out of turn. He was the guy you called when you needed to clean up your mess, no questions asked. If you were in trouble, Marty was the man who made it go away. Now, he owned a bakery. A cute, pastel-colored bakery in a sleepy little neighborhood, tucked between a flower shop and a yoga studio. I blinked when I saw him through the bakery window. Was this the same man who had helped run criminal syndicates? The man who could silence a room just by walking in? Now he was wearing a frilly apron that said "Need me" on it, looking like he might faint at any given moment. We walked in, and the smell of fresh pastries and cinnamon rolls hit me like a ton of bricks. It was surreal. One moment, I was navigating the chaotic world of my new life with my impossibly beautiful, yet terrifying father, and the next, I was standing in a pastel bakery, surrounded by cakes and cookies and Marty, who looked like he was about to faint from shock. The moment he saw Dad, the new Dad, the one who looked like a runway model rather than the feared iron fist enforcer, he froze. Completely frozen. His skin went ashen, and his mouth opened and closed as though he had forgotten how to speak. He blinked, then blinked again. His eyes grew wider, his pupils nearly swallowed his irises. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. No, he whispered, voice cracking, his eyes darting between Dad and me like he was witnessing some kind of twisted hallucination. No way. Dad just smiled, effortlessly charming, like he hadn't noticed the impending collapse of Marty's sanity. It's good to see you, Marty. Marty's knees buckled slightly as he let out a strangled sound, something between a whimper and a shout. He flinched back like Dad had just hit him with a sledgehammer. But Dad's smile didn't waver. You're, Marty pointed wildly, eyes still darting between Dad and me, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle that just wouldn't fit. What the hell happened to you? I bit my lip to keep from laughing. Of course Marty wouldn't recognize Dad. Of course this was his reaction. Marty had spent the last decade or so forgetting the existence of the terrifying figure that had once been the most feared man in the underworld. Now he was staring at the man in front of him, who looked like he belonged in a Dior ad more than a prison yard. Dad, my impossibly graceful, criminally soft-spoken father, tilted his head slightly, as if he were bemused by the whole situation. Prison was difficult, he said, his voice smooth and refined, betraying none of the violence that had once marked his every word. I had to adapt. Marty's face contorted into something that resembled horror. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His eyes rolled back for a second, and I swear he was about to faint right there in the middle of the bakery, surrounded by cupcakes and sugar cookies. I sighed, rubbing my temples, trying to suppress the headache that was brewing. Yeah, welcome to my life now, I muttered, half to myself, half to Marty. Marty didn't hear me. He was too busy trying to figure out if the man standing in front of him was an elaborate prank, a dream, or maybe some kind of nightmare that had just walked out of a high-end magazine. He raised his hand to his forehead, gripping it like he was trying to hold himself together, but all he managed was to knock a tray of macarons off the counter. I watched as he fumbled with the tray, then backpedaled, muttering under his breath, can I get you some coffee? Or, anything. Do you want a donut? I've got a great cinnamon swirl, don't worry about it, Marty. Dad's voice was kind, almost soothing, and yet there was something deadly beneath it, a reminder that this man had once turned entire criminal organizations into dust with nothing more than his reputation. It was hard to reconcile that man with the one who was now so gently trying to put Marty at ease. Yeah, no problem. Marty forced a laugh, though it was the kind of laugh you make when you've completely lost the plot. Just sit down. Have a seat. Let me get you a croissant or something. We all sat down at a small table near the window. Marty was practically trembling now, his eyes never leaving Dad. He was trying to act normal, but it was clear his mind was short-circuiting faster than a toaster on fire. Every so often, his eyes would dart nervously toward Dad, then quickly away, like he couldn't believe the man he once feared was now sitting in front of him like it was no big deal. Dad, still smiling politely, sipped the coffee Marty had awkwardly placed in front of him. His fingers, delicate and graceful as always, wrapped around the porcelain cup like it was made of glass. He took a sip, savored it for a moment, and then, without missing a beat, asked, "So, how's business, Marty? Still doing well?" Marty stared at him. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked over at me like I was the last person on earth who could explain what was happening. I shrugged. "Don't look at me. I'm just as confused as you are." "Well, Marty cleared his throat, shaking his head in disbelief, as though he was trying to reset his entire mental state. "Business is fine, yeah. We're doing okay. No crime syndicates trying to ruin my life anymore. So there's that." Dad chuckled softly. It was such a light, pleasant sound that it almost felt like a complete betrayal of his past. I had to fight the urge to look over my shoulder and make sure no one was about to pull out a weapon from under the table. "You know," Dad said thoughtfully, "maybe I should have gone into the bakery business. It seems peaceful." Marty almost choked on his own spit. "Yeah, sure," I muttered, deadpan. "Dad, you'd have the place in flames in a week. No way you're giving up that reputation." But Dad just smiled, his expression serene. The look of a man who had outgrown his past, but never truly left it behind. Marty was still trying to digest the fact that the man he had once called his best friend, his horror story, was sitting across from him, talking about croissants like nothing had ever happened. "I think," Marty said slowly, voice wavering, "I need to lie down." Chapter 4, The Return of the Past. Things escalated fast. The weird thing was, it wasn't even the kind of escalation you'd expect. There were no ominous phone calls, no threats from the shadows, at least, not at first. Old enemies just started sniffing around, like roaches in a dark kitchen, creeping into the corners of our lives without so much as a warning. But here's the catch. None of them recognized Dad. Not in this form. Not in the sleek, charming, dashing socialite disguise he'd perfected over the years. Dad had always been an anomaly, but this new version of him? Even I couldn't keep up. His hair was longer now, the kind of wild, untamed dark waves that made him look like a god from some ancient myth. His clothes were crisp, perfectly tailored suits that made him look more like the CEO of a tech empire than a former gang leader. His smile could melt the coldest heart, and his voice had this smooth, almost melodic quality that made you forget he could crush bones with a single flick of his wrist. The first one to find us was Detective Harper, the cop who had originally arrested Dad. It had been over a decade since he last laid eyes on him, but you'd think he'd remember the man who took down half of the city's underworld. Yet here he was, standing at our door, looking like he'd just been hit by a truck. His usually neat suit was wrinkled, and his face was drawn, with dark circles under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Calloway," he said, voice tight, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. You're supposed to be in prison." Dad looked up from his book, slowly placing his teacup down. No panic. No rush. He was so damn calm, it was like the world had paused just for him. "Detective Harper," he said, his tone warm, almost pleasant. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Harper's eyes flickered over Dad, more out of habit than recognition, I'm sure, and then glanced over at me, like he was waiting for the punchline. "I need your help," Harper said, his voice low, but intense. Some evidence has gone missing. I think someone's framing you for crimes you didn't commit." I exchanged a look with Dad, whose expression remained unreadable. Harper's admission hung in the air for a moment. Was he trying to imply that someone had taken the fall for Dad's old life? That someone had started to resurrect the empire he had left behind? Or was it something more personal? Something that might tie back to this new version of Dad, this civilized version who had long since left the underworld behind? Before either of us could say a word, the tension in the room thickened. I heard the door open behind me, the soft creak of the floorboards, then the sound of heavy footsteps, the sudden shift in the air, and then, just like that, someone tried to kidnap me. It all happened so fast that I didn't even have time to react. No warning, no seconds to think, just the jarring sensation of a hand gripping my wrist, pulling me backward, the sharp yank of my body toward the door. I barely had time to scream, let alone process what was going on, And then, nothing. Dad's hand had already moved. He'd been sitting there, gently sipping his tea, looking every bit like a well-bred gentleman with a penchant for expensive antiques and the latest gossip columns. But in the blink of an eye, he was on his feet, and I swear I didn't even see the exact moment he shifted. 1 second, he was calm, collected. The next, he was a blur of movement, fluid, precise. No wasted motion. No hesitation. The man who had grabbed me? He never had a chance. Dad's fingers, long, elegant, and almost too delicate to believe they could cause harm, shot out in a blur, snatching the guy's wrist with a grip so tight it was like he was made of steel. The kidnapper grunted, trying to wrench his arm free, but it was as if Dad's hand had turned to iron. And then, just like that, he spun, the kidnapper's arm twisting in a direction that didn't make sense. There was a sickening crack, a flash of pain on the man's face, and in one smooth motion, Dad had him on the floor, barely conscious. But that wasn't even the crazy part. No, the crazy part was that Dad didn't break a sweat, not a single drop, not a hair out of place. His suit was still pristine, not a wrinkle to be seen. His tea was still sitting there, waiting for him like the calmest moment in the universe. I stood there, open-mouthed, watching this happen in real time. 1 second, the guy was lunging at me, and the next, he was flat on the ground, groaning in pain. It wasn't even fair. The whole thing had unfolded so effortlessly, so fluidly, that it felt like I was watching a scene from a slow-motion action movie. What the hell just happened? I whispered, still trying to wrap my brain around it. Dad, who hadn't even broken his smile, gave me a look that could only be described as fondly amused. Just taking care of business, he said, as calm as if he had just picked up his dry cleaning. I stared at him. Then I glanced back at the man on the floor, the one who had tried to drag me away. He was writhing, clutching his arm, barely able to breathe. Detective Harper, who had been standing there in stunned silence, finally snapped out of his stupor. His eyes were wide, his mouth agape, as he looked from Dad to the man on the floor and back again. "Who the hell are you?" Harper choked out, voice barely more than a whisper. Dad turned toward him, completely unruffled. "I'm just a man who appreciates the finer things in life, detective." He looked down at the guy on the floor with a mild glance of disdain. "And I don't tolerate interruptions." Harper didn't say anything. He just stared. And for a moment, I thought the guy was going to collapse from the weight of the realization hitting him. I glanced back at the kidnapper, whose face was now a mixture of confusion and pain. My heart was still pounding in my chest, the adrenaline making everything feel surreal. My father, the man who had once been known as the Iron Fist, was now a socialite who could silence people with a wave of his hand, a smile, or a perfectly timed move. And yet, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of comfort in the chaos. Dad's calm was so complete, as if he was in complete control of everything, every situation, every threat. Even when things escalated beyond belief, he just handled it without missing a beat. I turned back to him. "You really know how to make an entrance, don't you?" He just smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips. "I prefer to think of it as finely tuned." And I, for one, couldn't agree more. Chapter 5. Undercover Disaster. The trail led us to a high society gala, dripping with glitter and champagne, as expected. But here's the thing. Nothing about it screamed high society. Behind all the gold-trimmed chandeliers and perfectly manicured smiles, it was all a front for a massive underground crime syndicate. Classic move, really. If you're going to commit crimes, you might as well throw a masquerade ball and act like it's normal. And as usual, my mother decided this was our moment to infiltrate and gather intel. Like we didn't have enough drama already. Dad, who had been blissfully unaware of how deep we were getting into this whole mess, finally caught wind of our plan. He turned to Mom, horrified. "Evelyn, no," he said, voice thick with dread. It wasn't just a refusal. It was a warning, like the world's best ex-gangster was about to face a fate worse than death, an evening in a tuxedo. But Mom, who always knew how to push every button, smiled like she'd just discovered the world's best joke. "Evelyn, yes," she said with that glint in her eyes. The kind of glint that meant no one was getting out of this unscathed. I, naturally, was caught in the middle of this emotional hurricane. I'd already seen this disaster unfold before, and it never ended well. "I want a refund on my entire life," I muttered, staring at the ceiling like it could offer me some kind of escape. Mom didn't miss a beat. "You're part of the package deal, sweetie. We're all in this together." And so, 3 hours of hair, makeup, and a designer gown later, Dad emerged from the bathroom, looking like he belonged on the cover of Vogue. Not even fair. I'm not exaggerating when I say he was the most beautiful man in the room. and I'd seen a lot of beautiful men in my life. But this was something else. His hair, which was always a bit untamed, now looked like it had been carefully sculpted by some magical force. His tuxedo fit him like it was made just for him. Probably because it was, but I wasn't going to question that. His jawline was more pronounced than it had any right to be, and his eyes. Don't even get me started on his eyes. They were dangerous. The kind of eyes that could make you forget your own name, and wonder if you'd accidentally fallen in love with a secret agent. And let's not even mention the way he carried himself. He didn't just walk into a room, he glided, like he was on a runway, but with way more swagger and a touch of menace. You could almost hear the oohs and ahs as he moved through the crowd, even though no one had said anything. I had no idea how he pulled it off, but what I did know, I was deeply regretting that I had come along for the ride. All right, Mom said, practically rubbing her hands together. Time to work some magic. She handed Dad a glass of champagne, like it was going to be the weapon of the century. Dad gave her a look that was equal parts resigned and exhausted. You realize, he began, speaking with a calm, measured tone that only increased my anxiety, this is just a gala, not a bloody gang war. Mom ignored him. The gala is the gang war, darling. I swear, you're so naive. She patted his arm like he was a child, and started scanning the room. And then, of course, someone recognized him. You could feel it before it happened, the shift in the room, the sudden tension in the air. Dad, being the suave, unflappable man that he was probably too focused on scanning the crowd to notice. But I saw it, and I knew. The moment the guy approached, tall, dark-haired, and entirely too smug for his own good, I immediately regretted everything. Zane Calloway, the man said, his voice full of surprise and amusement. Well, well, well. I knew it was you. Dad's smile never wavered, but his eyes narrowed slightly. That was the thing about Dad. He was like a perfectly manicured garden hiding an ancient, dangerous creature beneath the surface. One wrong step, and you were dealing with a whole different beast. I'm sorry, Dad said smoothly, his voice almost sweet. You've mistaken me for someone else. But the guy wasn't buying it. No. It's really you. I'd recognize that face anywhere. It's been, what, 15 years? The guy took a step closer, and his grin was like something straight out of a bad Mafia movie. Iron Fist, huh? Thought you'd gone soft in your old age. Mom, of course, found this absolutely hilarious. She leaned in to whisper to me. He's like a very expensive wine. You don't just lose that kind of reputation. But I could see where this was headed, and I was so not ready for it. Dad, still smiling, took a leisurely sip of his champagne, as if this whole thing wasn't about to go sideways. It's not Iron Fist anymore, my friend. He winked. Try Gentleman of Leisure. And just like that, everything went sideways. Before the guy could say another word, Dad had already taken care of him. Not with a punch, not with violence. No, this was classier than that. With a flick of his wrist, he dropped the guy's drink, on purpose, splashing it across the front of the guy's expensive suit. And with the most graceful apology you've ever seen, Dad stepped back. The guy was too flustered, too mortified by the mistake, to even remember why he'd been suspicious in the first place. But of course that was only the beginning. Somehow, in the mess of things, Dad was soon surrounded by a crowd of eager, wealthy people, all of whom seemed to believe they were talking to the next big thing in socialite circles. To be fair, Dad was the next big thing, but none of them had a clue that the man in front of them could have taken down an entire crime syndicate with nothing but a silk handkerchief. I, on the other hand, was ready to crawl under the table and never emerge, because the more attention Dad got, the more obvious it became, this whole evening was spiraling out of control. And of course, right as the room reached peak chaos, someone tripped and knocked over a giant candelabra. Cue complete, unadulterated disaster. Chapter 6, The Final Showdown. Turns out, the real villain wasn't some dark, shadowy figure from Dad's past. It was someone even more infuriating, Mom's business rival. A woman who had spent years scheming and plotting to take over her empire. And as if that wasn't enough, she had the audacity to frame Dad for crimes he didn't commit, trying to push Mom into cleaning up the very messes she had been manipulating behind the scenes. She thought she could use him to weaken Mom, maybe even make her back down from her corporate throne. But, as always, she had seriously underestimated my mother. Mom, as calm as a cucumber, leaned back in her chair, sipping her wine like we weren't in the middle of a massive conspiracy. You really thought you were playing me? She scoffed, a smirk curling at the corner of her lips. You're pathetic. I watched, stunned. She wasn't even raising her voice, and yet, every word felt like a slap. The business rival sputtered, clearly flustered, her plan crumbling in front of her. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Then, just when I thought this couldn't get any more ridiculous, Dad, who had spent the entire evening perfecting the delicate, refined gentleman routine, dropped the act. It wasn't a slow unraveling. It was a snap, like someone had flipped a switch. One moment, he was casually adjusting his cufflinks, the image of grace and sophistication. The next, he was standing tall, his posture shifting, muscles tightening like a coiled spring. And there it was, the iron fist. His eyes sharpened, the familiar cold calculation returning in an instant. His expression went from gentlemanly to lethal. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw the man who had once torn through entire crime families without breaking a sweat. The rival's smug grin faltered as she realized the monster she had been trying to manipulate had never truly gone away. "You thought you could play me?" Dad's voice was a low growl now, dripping with an anger that was barely restrained. He cracked his knuckles, the sound echoing through the room like a promise. Mom didn't even flinch. She simply raised her glass in a quiet toast to herself, because this was exactly the kind of showdown she lived for. Within minutes, the woman was no longer in control. Dad's quiet, methodical destruction of her plans had her scrambling, backing down with a quickness that was almost sad to watch. It wasn't even close to fair, and honestly, it was hard to feel bad for her. The entire room was left in stunned silence as the two of them, Mom and Dad, the terrifyingly beautiful, undefeated power couple, stood unchallenged. I didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or hide under the table, because in that moment, I realized something. My family, we didn't just survive chaos. We created it, embraced it, and thrived in it. And I was just along for the ride. Epilogue. Family chaos forever? So yeah. Dad was exonerated. The charges were dropped. The lies unraveled, and with one well-timed phone call, the real culprit was exposed for what she was, a bitter, jealous mess who thought she could take down a legend. Dad tried to go back to his old self, maybe even ease back into the world of ex-gangster life. But let's be honest, once you've been spoiled by skincare routines that defy the laws of physics, there's no going back. The man looked better than he ever had before, which made things even more complicated. How was I supposed to take him seriously, when he was literally glowing like a walking Instagram filter? As for Mom, she was still a terrifying force of nature, as sharp as ever, still running her empire with an iron fist of her own. But now, instead of being on the warpath, she'd be entertaining billionaire investors, while casually plotting world domination over brunch. Classic Zane Calloway, really? I did my best to not think about it. Or, at least I tried to, because the truth was, no matter how much I tried to avoid it, I was always going to be in this whirlwind of chaos. And me? Well, I'd come to terms with my fate. I'd spent my whole life trying to hide from it. But the reality was I was never going to have a normal life. Normal families don't have a mom who's a CEO, a dad who's a former gangster turned socialite turned unstoppable force, and a daughter who just wants a break from the insanity. Nope. This was my life. This was my family. And honestly, I had no choice but to accept it. Because when you're raised by the Iron Fist and the Queen of Corporate Warfare, there's no escaping the chaos, it's in your blood. But you know what? As ridiculous as it all was, I wouldn't trade them for anything. Because deep down, despite all the madness, all the bizarre moments that made me question reality, I knew one thing for sure. There was no one else I'd rather have by my side in a fight. And no one else I'd trust more to mess up my life in the best possible way. The end.